Delaney Brooks never stopped on empty roads, and she certainly never trusted a stranger in an oil-stained jacket. But the day her luxury prototype died on a rain-soaked highway outside Seattle, merger signing an hour away, driver gone, phone signal dead, sky cracking open above her, she had no good options left. When a single father in a battered pickup pulled over and said, "Let me fix your car," Delaney nearly called him a threat. But the moment Coulter Briggs opened that hood, his expression changed completely. Something was inside her car that had no business being there. Stay close, because what Coulter found under that hood would make Delaney question everyone she had trusted inside her own company. The rain arrived in sheets over the outskirts of Seattle that Tuesday afternoon, the kind that turned every highway into a gray smear and made the pine trees on both shoulders look like black curtains being slowly drawn shut. Delaney Brooks was behind the wheel of a vehicle she rarely drove herself, a midnight blue prototype sedan from Brooks Meridian Motors' upcoming luxury line, running the numbers in her head with the mechanical precision of someone who had spent 15 years building a company from a regional dealership into one of the most watched automotive brands on the West Coast. The merger she was driving toward was the largest single transaction of her career, and every hour until the signing felt like a countdown she couldn't afford to lose. Her driver had sent a message at 6:45 that morning saying only that he was unwell and unable to come in, and her assistant Cassidy Monroe had followed with something vaguer and more urgent, flagging irregularities in the board schedule and asking Delaney to call before she left. But the car was already moving and the world outside was already disappearing into rain. Delaney told herself she would call from the road, and then the road offered nothing. The car died without drama. Only the slow, clean shutdown of a machine that had stopped wanting to cooperate. The dashboard going dark except for amber warnings she had never seen on this model, the engine cutting, the door locks cycling on their own in a rhythm that had nothing to do with her hands. Her cell phone showed full bars for 11 seconds before the signal collapsed to nothing. She sat with both hands on the wheel, watching the rain sheet across the windshield, understanding this was a bad situation but not yet understanding how deliberate every element of her predicament was. A stranded CEO in an expensive prototype with a meeting in 50 minutes. She tried the ignition twice and got nothing, then checked the charge indicator and fuel readout, both normal, and the normalcy of those readings was what should have alarmed her. A car with full fuel and full charge does not simply stop unless something upstream of both has decided it should. She was still reasoning through that when headlights appeared in her rearview mirror. It was a pickup, old and dark-colored, the kind that accumulates small dents and rust along the wheel wells without becoming less functional, and it pulled up behind her with the quiet deliberateness of someone who had already decided to stop before they drew level with her. The man who stepped out was somewhere around 40, broad-shouldered without being large, wearing a canvas work jacket with a dark stain along one sleeve that was almost certainly gear oil, and he moved through the rain without rushing, the sign of a man either entirely at ease or entirely without pretense. Through the rain-blurred glass she could see that the back seat held a child's booster seat, a bright orange backpack decorated with planets, and a single small sneaker that had fallen onto the floor mat, details she filed away with the same analytical reflex she applied to everything. The man stopped a respectful distance from her window, knocked twice on the glass with one knuckle, not the knock of someone demanding entry, but of someone announcing themselves. And she lowered the window 2 inches and said nothing. "Looks like your system locked up," he said, his voice level and unhurried, not the overeager pitch of someone hoping to seem useful. "Let me fix your car. If you don't trust me, keep the doors locked and watch my hands." Delaney said nothing for 3 full seconds, because the sentence required consideration. In her experience, People who offered unsolicited help in isolated places generally wanted something, and the fact that this man had preemptively named her distrust, rather than ignoring it or performing offense at it, was something she could not immediately categorize. He was making her a very specific offer, transparency in exchange for nothing more than her attention. She looked at the orange backpack on his rear seat, looked back at his face, and reached beneath the steering column for the hood release. Coulter Briggs worked the way engineers work when they are not performing for an audience, methodically, quietly, without the exaggerated gestures of someone trying to look competent. He pulled a compact LED flashlight from the chest pocket of his jacket and swept it across the engine bay with the practiced ease of a man who has long since memorized where to look first, and what he saw in the first pass was notable for what was not wrong. The battery terminals were clean, the coolant level was correct, the serpentine belt was intact, and the fuel injector rail showed no signs of stress. Delaney watched all of this through the gap in her lowered window, her arms folded across her chest, and her phone held in her right hand like a reflex, and she noticed that he touched nothing unnecessarily. He examined things in a sequence that suggested a very specific diagnostic logic, rather than the random probing of a general mechanic. After 4 minutes he stopped moving entirely, his flashlight aimed at a section of the engine bay near the central fuse cluster, and he stood in the rain with the stillness of a man absorbing information he had not expected. She lowered the window another inch and asked what he had found. He still didn't answer right away, which would have annoyed her if his expression had not made it clear that he was not ignoring her. He was thinking, which was a different thing entirely. He moved the flashlight a few degrees, crouched lower to see beneath a small plastic cover near the secondary control relay, and when he straightened up, his face had the flat, careful quality of someone processing something he wished he hadn't found. He reached into the engine bay with 2 fingers, very slowly, and lifted the corner of a small trim panel near the fuse housing. Not a panel that comes loose on its own, but one that had clearly been repositioned with some care. What was attached to the underside of it did not belong to this vehicle, or to any production vehicle Delaney had reviewed during her years in the automotive business. It was approximately the size of a matchbox, matte black, with 2 thin antenna leads and a micro-connector running directly into the vehicle's data bus, fitted with a precision that suggested familiarity with this car's specific architecture, tucked against the harness bracket in a way that would appear, to a casual look, as part of the wiring geometry. Coulter let the panel fall back and walked to her window. He told her the device was not factory and not merely a tracker. Something like that could create selective system interrupts, make a specific module drop out, make the car register a fault condition even when all its hardware was functioning correctly, and it could relay GPS coordinates in real time to whoever held the receiver. He paused, then said the thing that made the temperature in the car seem to drop. Whoever installed it knew this car specifically, not just the model, not just the year, but this particular vehicle's configuration. Delaney went still in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She asked the question she had been circling since he finished his first sentence. How did a roadside mechanic in a decade-old pickup truck know how to read a covert electronic implant in a vehicle that had not yet been released to the public? Coulter looked at her steadily and said only that he had spent time with high-security automotive systems, which was technically accurate and almost entirely unhelpful as an explanation. But before Delaney could push him further, a pair of headlights appeared at the far end of the road, not moving quickly, just drifting forward through the rain at the idle speed of a car that is checking rather than driving. Coulter lowered the hood partway without being asked. "Don't look directly," he said. "They're seeing whether you're still stationary." Delaney looked at the half-lowered hood instead, and in the reflection of the windshield glass, she watched a dark sedan slow to almost nothing, before it drifted on, and she understood then, with the kind of clarity that arrives too late to feel like insight and too early to feel like relief, that she had not broken down. She had been parked. Coulter told her not to let the device go silent. If the signal stopped transmitting, whoever was monitoring would know the interference had been found, and they would move to whatever the contingency plan was, which, given the sedan that had just passed, almost certainly involved arriving at her location in person with a story ready. He reached into the cab of his truck and retrieved a small signal emitter from a locked case beneath the passenger seat, a device no larger than a deck of cards, and explained with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done this before that it would spoof the implant's transmission frequency and keep the remote monitor believing the car was still locked down at the same GPS coordinates. He set it inside the engine bay, clipped to the fuse panel housing, and closed the hood fully. Delaney sat watching this through the windshield and understood with slow, building certainty that the man standing in the rain in front of her car knew how surveillance technology worked the way surgeons know incisions, not from reading about it, not from guessing, but from the cellular memory of having built it. She made a decision and lowered the window fully. She told him the truth she had been parceling out in careful pieces. She was the CEO of Brooks Meridian Motors. She was 40 minutes from a merger signing that represented the single largest transaction in the company's history, and her arrival, her composure and the condition of the car she was driving, which was the company's own flagship prototype, was directly tied to whether the board would proceed with confidence. She told him that the vice president of operations, a man named Garrett Holloway, had been positioning himself as an alternative authority for months, and that any public evidence of instability on her part would be weaponized immediately. She told him this because she had no one else to tell it to, and because the rain was still falling, and because this man had just shown her something inside her own car that she had not known was there. Coulter considered this and said, very simply, that what had been done to her car was not designed to harm her physically. It was designed to embarrass her on a specific day at a specific time. A controlled failure in the right moment, in the right vehicle, would be exactly the kind of optics that made a board nervous and made a CEO look like someone who couldn't manage the product she was selling. Her phone remained dead. Coulter handed her a compact satellite communicator from the same locked case, a ruggedized older model, and told her it could send short messages over a narrowband relay unaffected by the interference around her vehicle. Delaney typed quickly and sent to Cassidy Monroe, delay signing. Check Garrett. Car compromised. While she was sending, the dark sedan returned. This time it stopped, and two men in dark suits stepped out with the deliberate calm of people who believe they are managing a situation. They identified themselves as corporate security dispatched to assist the CEO, but Delaney did not recognize their faces, and their badge lanyards showed Brooks Meridian logos with a font slightly wrong, a color slightly off from the standard issue she walked past every morning. Coulter stood in front of the hood and told them the car was not yet safe to restart. A restart in its current fault state could trigger a module lockout requiring hours to clear, and he said it with the unimpressed certainty of a man describing a broken lawnmower, because the only way to contradict him without revealing their own knowledge of the implant was to know more about the car than a corporate security officer should. The men stood in the rain and looked at each other. Delaney kept her eyes forward and her hands still, and for the first time since the engine had died, she did not feel alone in this. The two men in wrong low badges did not leave. They retreated to their sedan and sat with the engine running, which confirmed that their instructions required them to maintain line of sight. Coulter walked casually to the rear of his truck as though retrieving a tool, and in the process photographed their license plate with a phone Delaney had not noticed him carrying until that moment. He returned to the engine bay without any change in his expression. But something in the set of his jaw was different, and Delaney had been reading people's faces across boardroom tables long enough to know that whatever he had found was not what the plate was supposed to say. He told her, without looking up from the hood, that the registration traced to a leased vehicle returned 18 months ago, and that the vest insignia on the men did not match the contracted security firm that Brooks Meridian had used for the past 4 years. Delaney gripped the edge of her window and felt the kind of anger that has nowhere clean to go. A fury not at the men in the sedan but at the systemic assumption behind them, the belief that she could be moved around like a piece on a board, that her schedule and her driver and her car and her cell signal could all be quietly adjusted by someone who understood her routines better than she understood the risk embedded within them. She had always believed she was the one who controlled the variables. The man who had neutralized her prototype's tracking device and was now methodically exposing the theater of the operation around her had spent the last 15 minutes dismantling that belief piece by piece. Coulter said she had 2 real choices and laid them out without embellishment. Get into the sedan with the men whose credentials were theater, and be transported to a location of their choosing where there would be no neutral witnesses, or stay. Trust him long enough to reach a position where she held evidence rather than only suspicion, and walk into that meeting on her own terms. He did not tell her which to choose. He simply described both and waited. She asked him what he wanted: money, a contract, leverage, because in her world there was always a transaction, always a price attached to someone standing between her and the thing that wanted to hurt her. Coulter let the question sit for a moment longer than was comfortable, and when he answered, he did not look at her but at the back seat of his truck, at the orange backpack with the planet stickers. He said he had a daughter who was 8 years old, and that, if she were ever stranded on a road with the wrong people closing in, he hoped someone would stop and help her even when there was nothing in it for them. Delaney did not respond immediately. She had built her professional identity on the principle that every offer had a structure and every gesture a motive, and what Coulter had described was not a transaction. It was a personal standard which was harder to argue with than a contract. She looked at the backpack. She looked at the single sneaker on the floor mat. Then she looked at the man standing in the rain who had not once tried to make her feel grateful or frightened or indebted, only informed. Coulter sent a message on the satellite communicator to a contact labeled Vaughn Mercer. Found a corporate trap. Brooks Meridian, need eyes. He pocketed the device and went back to the engine, and behind them the sedan sat with its headlights on, and somewhere ahead of them in a conference room full of people who believed they already knew how this day would end, Garrett Holloway was refilling his coffee and checking his watch. The resort called Cascade Ridge was a collection of low cedar buildings set into a hillside above a man-made lake, the kind of place that charged conference rates and made people feel significant decisions required significant backdrops. Garrett Holloway was in the main conference room at 3:45, working the space with the easy comfort of a man who had rehearsed his grievances so many times they had started to feel like convictions. Circling the table, speaking quietly with institutional shareholders, positioning the upcoming hour as a moment of clarity rather than crisis. He had told 3 separate people in carefully casual asides that Delaney's prototype vehicle was having issues, framing it as information that had reached him by accident, though every word of it was deliberate. Whitney Boone stood near the presentation panel with a press document already queued on a dedicated server, framed as a proactive transparency statement ready to release the moment the first wire story appeared about a Brooks Meridian prototype stranded on a public road, and she had a media contact standing by who would accept the tip and frame the incident as a safety question before the company could respond. Cassidy Monroe was in a smaller side room with a stack of binders and a cup of coffee going cold beside her laptop, and she read Delaney's message 3 times, each time feeling the particular chill that comes from seeing a fear confirmed in 7 words. She had flagged anomalies in the technical sign-off records for Delaney's vehicle 2 weeks earlier. A small note in the maintenance log indicating the final pre-delivery systems check had been performed not by the standard vendor but by a specialty crew authorized under Garrett Holloway's operational budget code. A fact she had mentioned once in a weekly summary that Delaney had moved past without comment. She had not pushed at the time. Now she pulled the full service record, identified the crew lead, and located in the internal email archive a message sent 6 days prior flagging an anomalous control module reading. A message that had been acknowledged by Whitney Boone's office and quietly marked resolved without any technical follow-up. She began printing everything and did not stop. Vaughn Mercer was 300 miles south in a law office, and he read Coulter's message on the satellite relay with the expression of a man who had been expecting a particular phone call for a long time. He called back on an encrypted line within 4 minutes and asked Coulter, using a tone that was not discouraging but honest, whether he was sure he wanted to step back into this. A question that carried the full weight of everything that had been walked away from 7 years ago. Coulter looked through the windshield at Delaney's profile in the car ahead, then turned and looked at Lydia's backpack on the seat beside him, and his answer was simple and without drama. He said he had only stopped to fix a car, but the car appeared to be attached to something considerably larger. Vaughn was quiet for a moment, and then said the thing that had been true since the day Coulter filed his patents under a shell company and disappeared from the industry. Once he had opened that hood, the past was always going to find him. Coulter said nothing to that, because there was nothing to say that wasn't already obvious. Getting Delaney out of that stretch of road required moving without appearing to move. Coulter restored partial drive function to the prototype by isolating the affected control module from the network loop, enough to start the car in a degraded safety mode that would not broadcast to the vehicle's cloud uplink. But he left the spoofing device active in the engine bay, still telling whoever was listening that the car was stationary and the CEO was stranded. He explained to Delaney that she could not arrive in her own vehicle, because the prototype's onboard systems were still compromised, and the fault condition could be triggered again remotely the moment she was in range of the resort's network. She looked at the prototype, her company's car, the one whose door handles bore the Brooks Meridian emblem she had chosen herself, and said nothing for a few seconds. Then she got into his truck. The interior of Coulter's pickup was not what the CEO of a major automotive company was accustomed to, and this was obvious from the way she arranged herself in the passenger seat, carefully, as though the worn canvas upholstery required delicacy rather than the reverse. There was a child's drawing wedged between the dashboard and the windshield, a purple car with an improbably large roof and the word Le Dia printed in uneven capital letters across the bottom. There was a small thermos in the cup holder that smelled of reheated coffee. There was a worn structural engineering reference book on the rear floor beside the backpack, its spine creased from being opened flat too many times. Delaney looked at these things and understood that the person who lived inside this truck was a more specific person than she had initially assumed. Halfway to the resort, she asked him directly, "Who are you?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer, and then he said his full name, Coulter Briggs. The name landed differently than she expected. She had heard it once, years earlier, in a technical briefing presented to the Brooks Meridian Board by a licensing consultant summarizing the origin history of certain safety patents the company held through an indirect agreement with a third-party holding firm. The name had appeared in a single sentence describing the original inventor of the electromagnetic interference countermeasure architecture at the core of their top-tier security package. A man who had sold the foundational patents under unclear circumstances roughly 7 years ago and had not been publicly heard from since. At the time, she had not paid close attention because the licensing was already arranged and the man was already gone. She paid attention now. Coulter did not give her the full history. He said only that he had spent a decade developing safety systems because he believed the work kept people alive, and that at some point the people funding the work decided that safety was most valuable as a marketing claim rather than an engineering standard. He left the rest unsaid, and Delaney filled in the negative space the way intelligent people do when they already know the shape of the story. They arrived at Cascade Ridge and walked into the conference wing together. Coulter still in the oil-stained jacket, Delaney with her coat damp at the shoulders and her expression set. Whitney Boone saw them first, and her response arrived with the reflexive precision of someone who has spent years deciding which room each person belongs in. "Ms. Brooks," she said, looking at Coulter with open assessment, "you brought the mechanic to the board meeting." Vaughn Mercer stepped through the door behind them at that moment, having driven 3 hours from his office without being asked, carrying a leather briefcase and the particular composure of a man who has been waiting a long time for a room to become the right room. He looked at Whitney and said without warmth, "She didn't bring a mechanic. She brought the man who wrote the safety architecture your board has been licensing for 6 years." The room went very still. Delaney did not ask for silence. She asked for a delay, which was harder to argue with because delay is procedural and a board can generally survive 30 additional minutes more easily than it can survive a legal exposure. She told the room in the measured cadence she used when she wanted to be heard the first time and not have to repeat herself that the prototype vehicle she had been driving had been found with an unauthorized control device fitted to its data bus, that the device had caused the vehicle failure that delayed her arrival, and that the device's origin needed to be traced before she would sign any document transferring operational authority over any portion of Brooks Meridian to anyone. 2 institutional shareholders leaned toward each other. One independent board member asked whether this was a legal matter, and Vaughn confirmed it was. Garrett moved first. He said the delay was irresponsible given the timeline commitments the board had made to acquiring parties, said this was an isolated anomaly being elevated into a corporate crisis for reasons that had more to do with cold feet than actual evidence, and that the suggestion of deliberate interference was. And he paused here, carefully, the kind of accusation that should not be made without verification. His tone was smooth and his logic was technically coherent, and if Delaney had been alone in the room with no backup and no corroborating record, it might have worked. But she was not alone. The prototype was towed to the resort's mechanical facility, a well-lit garage bay normally used for servicing rental fleet vehicles. And Coulter stood before the open hood a second time. Not in rain and silence with a woman watching from behind locked glass, but under fluorescent light with 12 people in business attire standing behind him, their arms folded in varying configurations of doubt. Garrett called out twice that Coulter had no authorization to touch a company asset. Vaughn, without raising his voice, produced a notarized document from his briefcase that identified Coulter Briggs as the registered holder of 7 active patents licensed through a cascade of holding entities by Brooks Meridian Motors, which gave him a recognized intellectual property interest in any vehicle that incorporated the covered systems, and therefore standing to inspect the implementation of those systems in any company vehicle. Garrett did not respond to this. Coulter removed the spoofing device from his pocket and set it on the workbench, then reached into the engine bay and detached the interference implant from the data bus with the same unhurried precision he had used on the roadside. He placed it under the work light and explained, to the room rather than to any individual, that the device operated on a firmware protocol not commercially available, that it used a proprietary command language developed internally at Brooks Meridian for a cybersecurity stress testing program under Garrett Holloway's operational division. The protocol existed in only one location in the company's technical infrastructure, and access to it required administrator credentials at the vice president level or above. Every eye in the room moved to Garrett Holloway. Cassidy had arrived during the explanation and distributed printed copies of the maintenance log, the vendor authorization under Garrett's budget code, and the email exchange in which Whitney's office had marked a safety warning as resolved without follow-up. She moved around the outside of the group quietly, and when she had distributed everything, she stepped back and stood near the door with her hands clasped, not seeking recognition, only ensuring the record existed in more than one place. Garrett attempted a reversal, saying that Coulter could have installed the device himself, that a man who knew the technology well enough to recognize it was also a man who knew it well enough to deploy it. But Coulter pointed out, in the flat tone of an engineer explaining a fault, that the firmware on the device included a creation timestamp and an operator ID hash corresponding to a credentials profile that had last logged into Brooks Meridian's internal security infrastructure from the IP range assigned to Garrett Holloway's office workstation 9 days ago. Garrett said nothing. One of the shareholders asked for the recording to be preserved. Vaughn said he had already made arrangements. Garrett had one card left, and he played it the way desperate people always play their last card, loudly, in front of as many people as possible, hoping volume would substitute for logic. He turned to the room and said that whatever Coulter Briggs claimed to have built, his history in the automotive industry was one of failed litigation, disputed patents, and a voluntary exit that had the appearance of someone who had been shown the door rather than someone who had walked through it with dignity. He cited the patent dispute, cited the company acquisition that had restructured Coulter's original work into the holding entity from which Brooks Meridian licensed its systems, and said with the confidence of someone who believed he had already checked whether this rock had anything under it that Coulter Briggs was a bitter former player who had lost his relevance years ago and was now using this situation to stage a re-entry. Coulter did not respond, Vaughn did. Vaughn explained that Coulter and his late wife, Tessa Holloway, had jointly developed the foundational countermeasure architecture as a married pair of automotive engineers who had spent 4 years testing it in field conditions before filing the original patents under their own names. He explained that when Tessa's illness was diagnosed, the company that had been funding their development program, a firm with demonstrable financial ties that Vaughn documented by distributing a second set of papers from his briefcase, had presented Coulter with a structured offer that was, in effect, a forced sale. Accept the acquisition terms while Tessa was hospitalized, or face patent infringement counterclaims that would require years of litigation to resolve and would drain the resources Coulter needed for his family's medical costs. He had not sold under duress in the strict legal sense. He had signed under conditions that no reasonable person would describe as free. Tessa died 14 months later, and Coulter left the industry not because he had been shown the door, but because there was nothing left inside the building he recognized as the work he and Tessa had meant to do. Delaney listened standing very still and understood, with the particular discomfort of someone recognizing themselves in an unflattering mirror, that she had benefited from the licensing fees produced by those patents for years without knowing whose hands had built them or what those hands had cost. She asked Coulter why he had never pursued the restoration of his rights once Tessa was gone and the immediate pressure was lifted. He said that on the day Tessa died, he had made a calculation. He could spend the next 5 years in a legal fight that might produce a settlement, or he could be present for Lydia in every way he had not always been present for Tessa when the work consumed them both. He had chosen Lydia. He would choose her again. No one in the room said anything for a moment. Cassidy quietly passed a second folder to one of the independent board members. She had found, in the course of pulling the maintenance records that morning, a cross-reference connecting the acquiring company from 7 years ago to a group of early-stage investors whose financial instruments had later been converted into Garrett Holloway's founding stake in his own consultancy, which had been Brooks Meridian's primary operational tech vendor for 3 consecutive years. The pattern was not ambiguous. Garrett had not simply targeted Delaney today. He had spent years building toward a position that required erasing what Coulter and Tessa had built at the beginning, and he had always been close enough to both stories to know exactly what could be hidden and what could be made to look like something else entirely. Delaney stood at the head of the conference table with the stillness that comes after a very specific internal reckoning. She had spent most of her career treating power as something to be protected from rivals, from quarterly misses, from the small failures that accumulate into the larger narratives others use to define you. She had fortified herself against weakness the way engineers fortify structures, by identifying the load points and reinforcing them, by anticipating the stress and designing the response in advance. What she had not anticipated was the possibility that the stress would be introduced from inside the structure itself, by someone she had invited in and given load-bearing responsibility. Whitney spoke first, with the velocity of someone trained to get in front of difficult moments. She said the situation was manageable. The device could be characterized as an unauthorized test by an overzealous technical team. The board should absorb this internally before it became a public narrative, and the cleanest path forward was a quiet resolution in which Delaney accepted a temporary co-management structure to reassure investors while the investigation proceeded. She said it with the sincere urgency of someone who believes they are being helpful and is not. Garrett, hearing the framing and recognizing an opening, leaned forward and said he was prepared to help Delaney navigate this if she was willing to be pragmatic, that all he was asking for was a temporary authorization that would allow him to provide operational continuity during the investigation period. Standard language, nothing permanent. He said it the way people say things they have been planning to say for months, and the polish of it was its own kind of exposure. Delaney looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not angry but quieter and more final than anger, the expression of someone who has already decided. She said, clearly and without hesitation, that she would not be signing any transfer of operational authority today, or at any other point while Garrett Holloway remained affiliated with this company. She was suspending the merger proceedings pending an independent audit by a firm with no existing vendor relationship with Brooks Meridian. She was requesting Garrett's immediate administrative suspension and referring the matter to outside legal counsel within the hour. One of the shareholders said she was risking the valuation. Delaney said that an automotive company could survive a quarter of diminished valuation, but it could not survive the public discovery that its leadership had covered a safety compromise in its own flagship vehicle to protect a power arrangement. The customer who bought a Brooks Meridian car deserved better than a boardroom that had decided their safety was a negotiating chip. Coulter had not said anything during any of this. He had stepped back from the workbench and stood at the edge of the group with his jacket still stained and his hands in his pockets. Not disengaged, but understanding that this was not his decision to make, and that the right response to watching someone find their own footing is to not get in the way. Garrett, in the silence, made the mistake that people under pressure make when they have spent too long believing they are the most essential person in any room. He said, with a flash of genuine frustration breaking through the composure, that nobody was supposed to find that device. He said it to no one in particular and to everyone simultaneously, and the moment the words were in the air he understood what he had done, but the stillness of the room confirmed it was too late. Vaughn said, very quietly, that the meeting's recording had been running since Delaney entered the room and that the transcript would be preserved. Delaney looked at Coulter across the length of the garage and said, "I was wrong to think you were the threat." Coulter said, "You weren't wrong to be careful. You just almost trusted the wrong people." The room cleared slowly, the way rooms clear when the event that has just occurred is large enough that people need a moment before they can pretend to move with purpose. Vaughn stayed and spoke with the independent board members. The shareholders filed out with the subdued quality of people recalculating everything they had come in prepared to agree to. Whitney Boone left without speaking and was met in the corridor by a member of Vaughn's staff who had been waiting there for 20 minutes. Garrett did not leave on his own initiative. He left with the assistance of individuals from the legitimate Brooks Meridian security firm who arrived with paperwork. Delaney waited until the room was mostly empty before she walked over to Coulter. She told him she wanted to compensate him, that his time and expertise and the risk he had absorbed on her behalf had value, and she intended to acknowledge it with something concrete. Coulter listened to all of this and shook his head once. He said he wanted one thing. The young engineer who had flagged the anomalous module reading and whose email had been suppressed needed to be protected from professional retaliation, given full employment protections, a documented record of having raised the concern correctly before being blocked, and a direct line to someone on the board who would actually read it. He said that the people who told the truth inside large organizations were almost always the first ones penalized for it, and that if she wanted to fix what had broken in her company, she needed to start by protecting the ones who had tried to tell her it was breaking. Delaney said nothing immediately, which was how she responded when she was genuinely thinking rather than formulating a reply. She walked out to the parking lot and found Coulter's truck near the service entrance. Through the window, she could see a small figure in the back seat. Lydia, who had been brought to the resort by a woman named Jolene Harper while Coulter was occupied, and who was now sitting with a sketchbook and 3 colored markers, drawing something that involved a great many wheels. Delaney knocked on the glass, and Lydia looked up with the frank, unpresupposing curiosity of children who have not yet been taught to find certain situations complicated. She asked if Delaney was the lady whose car had stopped. Delaney said yes. Lydia said her dad was good at fixing things, as pure fact and without inflection, and turned back to her drawing. Delaney stood in the parking lot for a moment in the damp evening air and felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief exactly, but the first suggestion of it. She found Coulter and asked whether he would ever consider returning to the field in a formal capacity, not as an employee, but as an outside technical partner with full attribution for any work product. She said it carefully, because she understood it was not just a job offer, but the acknowledgement of a debt she could not repay, but could at least stop pretending she didn't owe. Coulter said he would not come back, plainly and without drama. Delaney nodded and said only, "If that ever changes, if you ever want your work to protect people again the way it was always meant to, I won't take it from you. I'll put your name on it." Coulter said nothing, but he didn't leave immediately, which was its own kind of answer. The investigation that followed was not quick, but it was thorough, which was rarer and more valuable. The independent auditing firm engaged by Delaney's board produced a report identifying 4 distinct instances of unauthorized internal access to vehicle systems in the 6 months prior to the merger signing, all traceable through access logs to administrative credentials within Garrett Holloway's operational chain. The specialty technical crew that had performed the final inspection on Delaney's prototype was a privately contracted group with no standing relationship to any major manufacturer, hired through a vendor shell that itself traced to a consulting intermediary connected to a fund Garrett had helped establish early in his corporate career. Before he came to Brooks Meridian, before he learned the company's architecture well enough to know exactly which seams to press on, the full picture resolved not as a single premeditated plan, but as a landscape of opportunism, a series of small arrangements made over years by someone who viewed the organization he worked inside as something to be harvested rather than built. Whitney Boone was placed on administrative leave and resigned before the process concluded, releasing a statement written in the passive voice that accepted no direct responsibility for anything. The engineer she had silenced, a 26-year-old named Marcus Hale, who had flagged the control module anomaly in an email sent at 11:47 on a Tuesday night and received an auto-classification response that buried it in a resolved issues folder, was reinstated with back pay for the 2 weeks he had been placed on informal suspension after asking about the flag's status. He was given a direct channel to the board's Technical Oversight Committee, accepted it, and used it within the first week. Coulter followed all of this from his garage on the satellite communicator, then from his phone once the signal interference dissipated, and finally from a news summary on a laptop balanced on his workbench. Lydia asked him once whether the bad man was going to be okay. Coulter thought about how to answer that and said the bad man was going to be held accountable for what he did, which was different from okay but probably as close to it as the situation allowed. Lydia said that seemed fair and went back to her homework. Cassidy came to see Coulter 3 weeks after the investigation concluded and brought him a box of documents located during the audit, physical records from the original patent dispute, archived in a storage annex of a corporate predecessor for 9 years. Among them was a formal letter written by Tessa in the last year of her life, addressed to a technical standards committee, arguing that the safety technology she and Coulter had developed should be maintained as an open access standard, because the people most at risk from automotive cybersecurity failures were not wealthy individuals with premium vehicles, but ordinary drivers who trusted that when they pressed the brake pedal, the car would do what it was supposed to do. Coulter read the letter at his workbench with the afternoon light coming through the small window above the tool rack, read it twice, and set it down on a clean section of the bench with one hand resting on it, the gesture of someone who has found a thing he had given up looking for. Tessa had always believed he would find his way back to the work, not for the industry, for the people the industry was supposed to serve. 3 months after the board meeting at Cascade Ridge, Brooks Meridian Motors announced the formation of an independent safety verification program, and the foundational architecture of the program was attributed in its first published specification to the Briggs-Holloway Safety Protocol, a name that appeared in print for the first time in a document bearing the Brooks Meridian corporate seal. Coulter had agreed to serve as a non-exclusive advisor, with full attribution and a licensing structure negotiated by Vaughn that restored his originating rights going forward. Not everything that had been taken, but enough to mean something, and enough to mean exactly what Tessa's letter had asked for. Delaney had made one call to confirm the arrangement, from her own phone, without an assistant, on a Tuesday afternoon between meetings, and Coulter had answered on the 3rd ring from a gravel driveway somewhere with the wind behind his voice. She had told him his name would be on everything, the specification, the implementation guide, the training materials. He had said that was all he needed to hear. The unveiling of the first vehicle certified under the protocol took place at a test facility north of the city, a flat expanse of asphalt surrounded by spruce trees and low hills, and Coulter arrived in the same truck he had always driven, with Lydia in the back seat and the small thermos of reheated coffee in the cup holder. Delaney was already there when they pulled in, and she walked toward the truck the way someone continues a conversation rather than begins one, as though the exchange that had started on a rain-soaked road had simply been paused and was now resuming. Lydia climbed out immediately and accepted the small yellow hard hat that a facility coordinator handed her with the seriousness of someone receiving a professional credential, then moved through the space, looking at everything with the complete absorption of someone who has already decided this is interesting. Delaney and Coulter walked together to the vehicle bay, where the certified model sat in the overhead light, like an ordinary car, which was exactly what it should look like, because safety is not visible on the outside of a well-built thing, only in its behavior under pressure. She asked him if he still thought about the road in the rain, and he said he thought about it the way you think about moments when a story could have ended differently, but didn't. She told him that what he had said about choosing Lydia over the legal fight, about the things that remain significant when the other things fall away, had changed how she understood what she was supposed to be building. Coulter did not answer that with words. He reached for the release latch on the hood of the certified vehicle instead, and Delaney's hand was already there, and they opened it together. The soft resistance and the clean mechanical release, and then the hood lifting to reveal an engine bay that contained exactly what it was supposed to contain, and nothing more, nothing hidden, nothing that had no business being there. Lydia appeared at Coulter's elbow and looked in with professional interest. "Dad," she said, "is this one going to stop in the middle of the road?" Coulter looked at the engine bay for a moment, then looked at Delaney. "No," he said, "not if the people who built it were honest about what's inside." Delaney looked at that open hood, the same gesture that had begun the entire story on a darkened road while the rain came down, and a stranger she almost didn't trust was telling her the truth she almost didn't want to hear, and understood that the answer he had given Lydia was the only promise either of them had ever really been making. The hood had been opened twice, once to reveal a betrayal, and once to show what the work had always been meant to be. I just put a new controller on, you know what I'm saying? There we go. Get something once you beat him. But you could go to the left and fight someone else first. What's up, Xavier? You can stress me the fuck out. I beat Elden Ring twice. God damn. Fast as hell, bro. God damn. Oh shit, I may actually just not be high enough level, bro. What's up, Raz? How you doing, bro? Carlos!